So we've been looking into how the Fed can use their three monetary tools in order to combat recessionary and inflationary gaps within the macroeconomy. But everything we've been looking at up till now is more or less on the macro side. How does it affect it big picture? Well, we also know that the macroeconomy will affect the decisions from a microeconomic perspective. So let's dive into the microeconomics perspective and how all of this is actually going to be affecting an individual's decision. Because we also know that the macroeconomic situation is actually developed based off all the microeconomic decisions. Remember that these two are interwoven, that the macroeconomic situations affect microeconomic decisions. Meanwhile, the microeconomic decisions as a whole, combine all of them together, gives a macroeconomic situation. So let's dive into it from a microeconomics perspective. And let's look at the interest rates impact. So interest rates will affect the investments in new equipment and buildings by businesses. The higher the interest rate, the cost of a loan. The higher the cost of a loan, the less likely that investment is going to be profitable. So the higher the cost of a loan, the less likely we're going to buy that new equipment or invest in that new building. By that same token, for households, investments in new residences. The higher the interest rate, the less likely a resident or a household is going to buy a new residence. Whereas low interest rates actually encourage them to buy houses or to build houses. So let's dive into the contractionary monetary policy. Remember, this is when we are going to try and get rid of an inflationary gap. So if we're trying to get rid of the inflationary gap, we're trying to drive up interest rates, which are making loans more expensive. So if the loans are more expensive, we see that investment expenditures by both businesses and households actually are depressed. They go down, they decrease, which that makes sense. Higher the interest rate, the less likely a business is that they're going to engage in that investment expenditure, or the less likely the household is going to be to engage in buying that new residence. So a contractionary monetary policy is actually going to depress the level of investment expenditures. On the same, or by the other token, that if we wanted to engage in expansionary monetary policies, remember this is when we're trying to get rid of a recessionary gap. So what are we going to do in an expansionary monetary policy? Well, we're trying to drive down these interest rates. We're trying to drive them down, which makes loans less expensive. As the loans become less expensive, it actually encourages investment expenditures by businesses and households. So let's dive into a couple of examples, and we're actually going to throw off numbers at you. And these numbers have already been calculated, and you can go back and double check them if you want to. You don't necessarily need to, but it's going to serve as a good foundation to show you what's really going on here. So we're going to first focus on investments in a new equipment by a business. So we're going to assume that a farmer is looking to buy a new combine and other equipment. So this farmer is wanting to buy a new piece of equipment or buy equipment, and they're looking to finance $150,000 for 10 years, making annual payments. So they're going to invest in, or they're basically asking for a loan for $150,000 over the next 10 years, making annual payments. This is going to be compounded once a year. And this new equipment is expected to generate $30,000 annually. So we're basically about to buy a new combine, buy new equipment, and that new equipment is going to earn us $30,000 more per year. So basically, what would it take for us to be able to afford this new piece of equipment? Well, if the new piece of equipment costs less than $30,000, we can afford it, right? So let's look at this table down here. So this table is showing, well, what is it going to take to engage in these different loans? At an 8% interest rate, the total annual payment is $22,000. So if this new piece of equipment or this new equipment is going to earn us $30,000 and the total annual payment is going to be $22,000, can we afford this particular loan? At 8%, we can actually afford the loan because it's going to cost us $22,000, but we make $30,000, and we're going to basically be profiting about $7,645 and some change. So we're actually going to be making money at 8% interest. The total interest payment or the annual interest payment will be about $7,000, and total interest is $73,000 over the course of this loan. But what happens if we increase the interest rate? Now we go from 8% to 14%. Well, what you would expect is that the interest payments go up. As interest goes up, it costs more. So the total interest payment goes up, annual interest will go up, and also because interest is going up, the annual total payment is going to go up as well. So now we have an annual total payment of $28,770, and I'm missing a number there, but about $28,770 and some change. So can we afford this loan at 14% interest, given the fact that we're going to make $30,000 a year? Yeah, we can still afford this. We make $30,000 a year, and it costs us $28,000. We can still afford this particular loan. So we can still engage in it, but the total cost is going up, interest cost is going up, so this loan is costing more, but we can still afford it. We won't make as much, but we can still afford it. Now, what about at 20% interest? Well, at 20% interest, of course, our annual interest payments going up, our total interest payments going up. We increase the interest rate, our total cost is going to go up. But now all of a sudden, we can no longer afford it. We generate $30,000 in revenue, but it costs us $35,000. We're losing $5,700 a year. It's costing us more than we're going to be making. So guess what? We will not engage in this loan at 20% interest. So the higher the interest rate, the less money that we're going to make off this investment, and the less likely we are going to be to engage in it. At 20%, we're just not going to engage in it. So basically, the higher the interest rate, the less investment we're going to do. So this is for one particular business. But imagine that every business was facing the same scenario, which they do. The higher the interest rate, the less likely they are to engage in those investments. So the lower the interest rate, the more likely they are. And that goes to show how it works from an individual's perspective, and all businesses will face the same decision-making process. So at 8% and 14%, the business can cover the payments. At 20%, this business can only service the debt. That is to say that they can pay the interest, but not the whole amount. They're servicing the debt, only paying the interest, but not the whole amount. Basically, they're not making any money. They're losing money at 20% interest, and they're not going to be they're not going to engage in this loan, showing how higher interest rates actually will decrease or depress the investment expenditure. Well, what about households? How does this work from the household perspective? Essentially, it works the same way. So let's say that a household can engage in a 20-year monthly loan for a $100,000 house. This is a $100,000 house, and the owner can afford $900 a month. At 8%, let's say at 8%, the annual payment is going to be, or the annual or the monthly payment, sorry, I've got this written wrong, but the monthly payment is actually going to be $848.78. Can they afford this payment at 8%? Well, yeah, it's less than $900. They can afford that house at 8%. But as soon as we jump up to 12%, well, now the cost of the loan is more. The monthly payment is over that $900. They can no longer afford it. They would not be able to buy a house at 12% interest. Why? Well, simply because the interest rate has gone up, and it's costing that household so much more in interest that it makes it no longer feasible for them. So simply, just to recap, from the microeconomic perspective, the lower the interest rates, the more enticing a loan is. The higher the chances of profitability for a business, and the more that an individual household can actually afford in terms of new residences. So the lower the interest rate, the higher the level of investment expenditures. It's going to encourage those investment expenditures. Whereas the higher the interest rate, the less likely they're going to invest that money in those expenditures. So basically, contractionary monetary policy is going to drive up those interest rates, lower the investment expenditures, and that's going to happen on an individual's basis, and that's going to be extrapolated to the macroeconomy. Versus on an expansionary monetary policy, it's going to drive down interest rates, encourage investment expenditures on an individual basis, which then extrapolates to the macro economy.